My name's Aric. I'm the state senator who represents the greater St. Cloud area in the Minnesota Senate for the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. And I'm incredibly grateful to be here with all of you today to have this opportunity to learn and discuss an incredibly important issue. And I want to emphasize those words in particular. You guys are kind of weird. And I say that with absolute love because you could be home watching Netflix. Some of you who are online probably are. But you didn't have to come out on a Thursday night to learn. That is something that is missing in our politics today and in our understanding of citizenship. So I'm incredibly grateful for you to be here. It is way easier to be a comment warrior on Facebook. It is way easier to just bend the knee in fealty to a fake king. It's a lot harder to show up and learn about the issues and then become a true advocate. So what we're going to talk about today is disturbing, and I think that's why you're here. It's challenging, and that's why you're here. But I'm so glad to be in a room with people, literally and virtually, who are up to that challenge, who realize that you should know what you're talking about before you become an advocate, that understands that being a good citizen requires you to be an informed citizen. And that's what you're doing now today. And I'm very grateful and proud to be with you guys here today. You are awesome. Now, a couple of, oh, thanks. Yeah, go and you can applaud that if you want. Give it up for yourselves. I myself, selfishly, am incredibly eager to listen to these two great people we have sitting up here who are tremendous experts on an area, on an issue that's incredibly important to all of us. We are in very strange times politically. That's not a controversial statement. It's not a partisan statement. That's a human statement. And when we talk about some of the things that are happening at the federal level or in our state, you can talk about what will happen. What will happen is nothing compared to what is happening, what has already happened. We are in the midst of chaos. That is incontrovertible. The situation that we're in right now is one where we might talk about potential consequences, but what I think is more important for us to do is to focus on what is already happening, what's actually happening all around us to all of our neighbors right here and right now. And I was reminded as I was driving here today of Martha Nussbaum, who's a philosopher, American philosopher, who wrote a book called The Monarchy of Fear. And in it, she talks a little bit about how monarchies require fear to keep people in compliance. And that fear is fear of the monarch, it's fear of power, it's fear of violence, because of the sole ownership of violence in the body of the monarch. But they also thrive when we inspire fear in each other. That's how they keep us disempowered, is by keeping us afraid of each other. And that's one of the great things about a room like this and a night like now is there is no fear. There is only curiosity and desire for better. So again, thank you for being here. A couple quick sort of housekeeping things. There are restrooms, but I don't know where they are. People are pointing that direction. So apparently the restrooms are out there. We're going to hear two fantastic presentations from our two friends, and then we're going to have a pretty good chunk of time for questions and answers that I will moderate. If you have a question, you have a little card to write it down on. If you raise your hand, one of our friends will come pick it up and they'll bring it up to here and then we'll be able to ask it for you. So please participate in the conversation. Write your questions, get them to our friends and they'll come up here and then we can talk about your curiosity. Also, there are a couple of very important upcoming events that I want to announce really quickly. One is Tuesday, September 6th at 6:30. I believe here will be some training for how to respond to immigration enforcement safely and effectively. So if you want more information about that, I might announce it again at the end of the night. But know that there is always something good going on somewhere where you can learn something about being a better advocate for your fellow Americans. And keeping in touch with the organizations that probably brought you here is a great way to find out about those events. And I do hope that you'll continue to show up in those spaces. Again, not just to protest. Protest's important, but to learn about how and what to protest about is just as important. And that's what some of these other events are going to be about. So today, our first speaker is going to be Angela. She is a nationally renowned expert on Christian nationalism and its intersection with masculinity, but she's also a Lutheran pastor, a journalist. She's written 2 books. like, it's crazy that she still has the time to sit down with us right now when she's not in the middle of writing another book. So we are incredibly lucky to have a chance to learn from her tonight. So please, let's all welcome Angela.
Great way to get us started. I'm glad to be here in Monticello. I think the last time I was out here at Monticello Middle School maybe was for Junior Olympic volleyball in high school. So I'm glad to be back out here. And the last time that I did an event with Indivisible was in Southern California in Laguna Beach. And we had this packed room, and they had the moderators started and stood up and started jumping around and led everybody through a cheer. And it was very exciting. Up here in Minnesota, you can tell I was really excited because I was very enthusiastically nodding as Aric was talking. So got a little bit different vibe here tonight. But I'm going to take about 20 minutes and compress what I usually do in an hour into about actually 15 minutes to give you guys a briefer on sort of a definition for Christian nationalism, an understanding of the rhetoric of Christian nationalism, and how Christian nationalism is connected to conspiracy theory, a war on truth. And all of that is really important when we're understanding what's happening with the militarization of ICE. Because as you all know, there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of things flying around online. And part of the weaponry that is amassed against American democracy right now is gathered together in this weaponry against a sense that people can know the truth. So that's how we're going to start. They'll move into Christian nationalism. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about, I didn't know this when I was writing my two books, but Red State Christians and Disciples of White Jesus framed very closely to the first and second Trump administrations. So the first book traces the beginnings of how Christian nationalism became intertwined with the Republican Party. And then now this second book looks at the transition from that first administration. We go from somebody like Mike Pence to a J.D. Vance, and the transition in how they understand Christian nationalism and how we've made this transition into increased profiling of violent masculinity. And we can see the role of violent masculinity and also right-wing identity politics when it comes to the militarization of ICE. And then Peter will explain all of it from there. So we're going to actually start with, I'm a Lutheran pastor. I'm not going to give you a sermon, but we are going to start with an object lesson from the Bible. This is not a faith-based lesson, but the reason that I do this is because I want you all to have in your back pocket a reference so that when somebody starts pulling out Bible passages at you to say, well, this is really supported by Christians, this movement of violence, of anger, of identity politics is grounded in Christianity, that you're going to have something both to use against it, but also to help you understand in a deeper way. So we're using the text right here as a way to understand further, not as a document of faith. But the text that we're going to look at is John 18, 33 to 38. And this is really a primer text for helping to understand the rhetoric and the communication methods of those who are pushing Christian nationalism right now in the US. So then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Did you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Now, this verse you want to pay close attention to, because this is a direct refutation from Jesus himself that he has not come to institute a Christian nation in this world, which is the direct claim of many in government right now. Verse 36, Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews." Now, note here, quick note about anti-Semitism. The Bible was written by people who were being persecuted by the Romans. And so there was a direct interest, and we see this play out over European history, in making sure to blame somebody else, anyone else, besides the very Roman government that carried out the crucifixion of Jesus. So we see a blaming of a marginalized, smaller group of people, the Jews, in order that Pilate and the Romans, who actually had the power and the military to carry out this crucifixion. So that's a side point, but it's an important note to look at how history develops and repeats. As it is, Jesus says, my kingdom is not from here. And note, just a quick reminder to everybody, Jesus is not American. And nowhere in the Bible is written in America, as much as the LDS folks might want to say it is. Okay. So Pilate responds. Now, this is where you're going to see some of this rhetoric of those who are pushing the ideals of Christian nationalism begin to form. Because what they do, they don't engage in a good faith conversation. What they do is look for holes in your argument and try to get you to question your own thoughts. Sometimes we call this gaslighting, which has become a very overused word. Pilate asked him, so you are a king? Note, he's not engaging in good faith. He's not seeking to understand. He's looking to poke holes in the argument. Oh, so you are a king. I gotcha. Have you ever been in a conversation with somebody who's looking for a gotcha? Yeah, not real helpful, is it? Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. So Jesus is making a very important claim here about inclusivity, about who is a part of what will become what people know as the Christian kingdom. And Jesus is saying that his kingdom, again, we're looking at this from a standpoint of rhetoric. He's saying that anyone, the way that this kingdom and this group is determined is by what people listen to and what people believe. It's not defined by ethnicity. It's not defined by skin color. It's not defined by what language people spoke. It's not defined by the religious practices that people do. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. There's a through line here that Jesus is refusing to allow Pilate to continue to distract him from this sense that there is a way for people to know the truth, which is something that AI and this call of fake news has all been trying to get Americans to reject, a sense that we can really know. Now listen to the last line here, and I think Eric's gonna like this one. The ending is, Pilate asked him, what is truth? Now, again, I want you to see this for a tactic. What is truth? A lot of times these folks, and we see them again in our politics today, they'll get into these big debates with you about something that on its face value seems really basic. That we don't want to round up people off the streets based on the way they look and put them into a detention center before they've committed any crime. We don't want to determine who can come into this country based on how much money they have or based on what they look like. But what people will do is they'll get into a really convoluted debate with you based on philosophy and based on how, no, this is actually the way that we should behave as good American Christians. And they'll draw you into these questions like, what is truth? Now, Pilate, again, is no philosopher. He's not really trying to get into some philosophical argument about what truth is. What Pilate is trying to do by asking this question is to turn upside down Jesus' claim to be telling the truth. So this is the very convoluted rhetorical method of Christian nationalists, and it will make you feel crazy, and it will make you question your grasp on the truth. Let's move to a definition of Christian nationalism. I'm going to have clipboards here that you can sign up for my Substack, and if you go on there and you click on any of the news posts, you can get this definition in bold. It's a bit of a lengthy definition, so don't worry about if you miss a couple of words, you can get it there as well. A Christian nationalism is a version of the idolatrous theology of glory, which replaces the genuine worship of God with worship of a particular vision of America. Now, I wanted to stop here for a second and briefly nuance this point because this is the place where we've seen a shift from 2016 to 2024, from 2017 to 2025. Christian nationalism, as its imagery, its politics, it started in really this appeal to patriotism, this appeal to the military, an appeal that was very attractive to a lot of people, including people like me, people who went to churches I pastored, folks who I knew from time working as a chaplain at the Veterans Hospital. We've moved now into 2025, where the Christian nationalism's worship of a particular vision of America has changed and shifted. And it's now not just worship of a particular vision of America, but increasingly, especially after the 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump last summer, has shifted into a more particular worship of individuals. And not only grounded in Trump himself, where you see with imagery of Trump with Jesus, with imagery of crusader, violent imagery, but we're also seeing a shift to an image of worship of a particular kind of masculinity. So we're seeing imagery of bigger muscles, we're seeing more and more weaponized imagery, and on the flip side, for women who are in the forefront of this movement, we're seeing hypersexualized, feminized imagery. And so this worship of a particular vision of America has shifted. We're seeing a change here, and it's something to note as we look at Christian nationalism's movement. But worship of a particular vision of America, now this is important, we're getting the historical perspective, which Peter will talk about more. Rooted in revisionist history of white people in the 1950s. I always say, if you go to like a typical mainline church, this is the time we will look back to and think, oh, these were the glory days. So they prey on people's good intentions of, oh, these were good times, and they turn it upside down. Because what Christian nationalism says is the reason this kind of America was the best is not because our Sunday school classrooms were full, or our family farms were flourishing, or people were able to get the GI Bill. But instead, they're saying that this is ideal because it happened before the civil rights movement, or the women's movement, or the gay rights movement. That the ideal time in America was when only a certain type of person had the most rights. And in case you missed it over the last week, Doug Wilson, who's known as being one of the pastors of our Secretary of Defense, Forest Lake native, Pete Hegseth, one of his pastors, Doug Wilson, has been openly advocating on national television, in national media, for getting rid of the 19th Amendment and returning to a household voting method, which means that in married households, effectively men would only have the choice to vote. So there's a reason why they want to go back to that. Christian nationalism supports a violent takeover of government and the imposition of fundamentalist Christian beliefs on all people. Christian nationalism relies on a theological argument that equates American military sacrifice with Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. Now, again, as someone who comes from a family with a lot of military veterans in it, someone who's worked as a chaplain with military veterans, this one really, really makes me upset because it diminishes the individual stories of military service people. And instead, what it does is it attempts to cast the American military in the form of a military in an authoritarian country like Russia. And it says that the military service people are there to serve the needs of the authoritarian leader. And as such, their sacrifice is akin to a sacrifice for God. And that's why they cast Jesus' sacrifice in the same vein. So you can read more about this in the first chapter of Red State Christians. But I went to churches across the country, all the way back in 2018, where they would show montages of American service members dying in battle and intersperse those montages with Jesus dying on the cross. They had a song to go along with it. It says, "We'll never forget your sacrifice. The way you lived, the way you died, we'll never forget your sacrifice." And what this does is conflate America the nation, and again, we're making this transition into one singular leader at the top of America with God. And it really diminishes the personhood of military service members. Christian nationalism suggests that Christians are entitled to wealth and power. Not that it should be equal, but that we as white Christians, American Christians, are entitled to more. In contrast, here we go to Jesus' theology of the cross, which reminds Christians that they too have to carry their cross, just as our crucified Savior did. So this part of the theological argument, you can see a contrast between the historic Orthodox witness of Christianity and the witness of the prosperity gospel, which is very intertwined with Christian nationalism and very popular in America today. And what Trump has done with his takeover of the Republican Party is saying that bringing prosperity gospel preachers into concert with more traditional conservative pastors like the Falwells, like Franklin Graham. He's brought these two groups together in the interest of making a lot of money and getting a lot of power. And in the process, the true story about Jesus has been lost. So to transition into talking about ICE, I said we mentioned identity politics. In the Obama years, there's a lot of criticism from Republicans that said, the left has become all about identity politics. The Democratic Party is all about identity politics. It's now the right and the Republican Party that are obsessed with identity politics. How this connects to the militarization of ICE and to Christian nationalism is that Christian nationalism is all about what does it mean to have an identity as a true and real American? And so we see this in hyper sexualized and hyper specific gendered imagery of what men and women are supposed to look like. I see that in trad wives on social media. We see it in hyper masculine imagery on social media. And where JD Vance comes in, as he has had multiple speeches recently, last year at the Republican Convention, but also at the Claremont Institute recently, he's trying to change how we define America from a nation based on ideals, sort of this Lincoln-esque idea that America is united by its ideals of equality, by the ending of slavery, by openness to immigration. And J.D. Vance is attempting to say, no, really what America's identity is based on is blood and soil. People are connected to their land, they're connected to their families, to their ethnicity. And that's what makes America what it should be and what is great. You can see very easily how that kind of rhetoric, as it has in the past, in many other countries that became led by authoritarian leaders, is that this kind of focus on an identity of a nation means that anyone who does not fit that identity, and it is coming for all of us, anyone who does not fit that identity is vulnerable, is at risk. And if you're not counted as one of those true Americans, then you are not somebody whose life and whose pursuit of happiness is valued under this government. So I want to pass it over to Peter. The last thing I'll say is, there is some hope. I know everyone always wants to know, what do we do? Where do we look? Who are doing things? I do know many in local faith communities are working out and reaching out to those who are impacted by ICE. There are lots of congregations within the Minneapolis Area Synod of the ELCA and the St. Paul Area Synod. One of the things that the Minneapolis Area Synod is collecting stories from people who have been impacted by ICE. There's also beginning a new program putting together people from faith communities and clergy, a group called Lighthouse. And also there's a huge need for any kind of legal aid. So there's lots of ways to get involved, but I really urge people to do it in your local communities. Connect with people who are already doing the work, and many of you probably are. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Angela. That was super fascinating. And I have to resist the urge to just fanboy out and hop straight into asking you stuff, because we get to hear from Peter too. But in the meantime, say I and maybe 399 of my closest friends wanted to buy your books. Would there be a way for us to do that?
I do have books. I do have books out there. Red State Christians, Disciples of White Jesus. Limited amount tonight. They're available wherever books are sold. Go to your local bookstore. They are at your local library. Here, they're $25. I can take Venmo or cash or cash or check. But thank you.
Next, we get to hear from Peter. Peter taught U.S. history at Macalester for 30 years with an expertise in labor history and history of immigration. Obviously, two incredibly germane topics to the world we're living in right now. He also co-founded the East Side Freedom Library in St. Paul. So I'm really eager to hear what he has to say. So please, let's welcome Peter.
Thank you. I wanted to start by bringing a message from an event that we had Sunday at the East Side Freedom Library, where an organization called Minnesota 8, it's an organization of Southeast Asian immigrants, children of immigrants, who organized a press conference to talk about recent arrests and deportations of Hmong American citizens being arrested, deported, taken away from their families. And the message that I wanted to share with you and that really shapes my comments this evening are that they asked listeners, what are your immigrant roots? What are your immigrant roots? And I realize as someone who's taught immigration history now for more than 40 years, that it is remarkable how little most of us know about our own immigrant roots. And I want to talk with you tonight about what the content of that might be and how might we think differently about the challenges that current immigrants are facing if we were more aware of our own immigrant roots. And listening to Angela, I realized that in part, that history is the history of alternatives to the narrative of Christian nationalism that she's talking about. And I found in teaching immigrant history that there are some very simple concepts that take us a long way in understanding. The first concept is push. What pushes people to leave where their families have lived for generations? The second concept is pull. What pulls them to a particular place, a country, a region, a city? Thirdly, the concept of chain migration. How are people connected to other people in extended families or through villages and cities? They know people where they're going. And fourth, what is the cultural baggage that people carry with them, even if they're very poor, don't have a bunch of suitcases, but they have rich cultural baggage in language, folklore, foodways, ideas and values. And one of the amazing things, it's something that really helped me understand this, was stumbling across a document at the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota, a document that was a lesson plan from Hibbing in 1925, and it was titled Americanizing the Immigrant Woman Through Home Economics. And it was essentially an anti-booyah lesson, and how to, the lesson called for plates with dividers to be handed out to the students, and for them to be taught meat went in one section, potatoes went in another section, and vegetables went in a third section. Don't mix them. And one of the consequences of that way of cooking meat is you had to buy more expensive cuts of meat if you were not going to let it cook in a stew a booyah for hours and hours. And so it was also pushing their families into a cash-driven economy. So I want us to think about our own immigrant roots. And I want to share another very specific Minnesota, actually two Minnesota stories. One is in the 1880s, a barrel of flour milled in Minneapolis out of wheat that had been grown in western Minnesota or the Dakotas, transported by rail, brought into Minneapolis, ground into flour, put into barrels, put on trains again, shipped through my neighborhood on the east side of St. Paul, shipped to Duluth. In Duluth, the barrels were taken off a train, put on a ship. The ship went across Lake Superior, out the St. Lawrence Seaway, across the Atlantic Ocean. By the time that ship got to the harbor in Prague or Bremen or Warsaw or other European cities, the flour undersold flour that was being milled in those cities out of wheat that was being grown in those countries, because American industry of milling, the application of American industry to agriculture, the largest factory in the United States in the 1880s was the McCormick Harvester Works in Chicago. That the consequence for farmers in Central, Southern, Eastern Europe was that they couldn't get a price for their wheat that enabled them to pay their taxes, pay their mortgages. And so when those ships turned around and came back to the United States in steerage, in those spaces where barrels had been shipped going east, now the older children of farmers were sleeping in steerage, coming to the United States, where their parents said, go get a job, earn a wage, send us money home so that we can keep the farm. 110 years later, in the 1990s, corn flour, cornmeal, grown, milled, processed in Minnesota, and shipped to Mexico, undersold corn, cornmeal, and corn flour, grown in Mexico, processed in Mexico. And what did Mexican farmers do? The same thing that Polish, Austrian, Croatian, Serbian, Norwegian, Swedish farmers had done. They told their older children, go to the United States, get a job, earn a wage, send money home so that we can keep the farm. Inside those cultures that got transplanted to the United States, the cultures that were being challenged by night school and Hibbing to Americanize the immigrant woman through home economics, internal to those cultures were values of cooperation, mutuality, care for each other. That old concept from England and other parts of Western Europe of the commons, that people should work together to protect each other, to benefit. That's the alternative to the Christian nationalism that Angela is talking about. That is inside the new cultures of Hmong, Karen, Oromo, Eritrean, Guatemalan, Mexican, Honduran, Salvadoran, cultures that are struggling to survive in the United States today, being bombarded, being ostracized, being criminalized, being attacked by ICE, the Department of Homeland Security, so on. That those values were also in the cultures that our grandparents, great-grandparents, brought with them here to the United States, to Minnesota, to Wright County, to Ramsey County, where I live. I want us to think about this crisis that we're facing today and ask, what would our grandparents do if they were here now, or our great-grandparents? How would they respond to it? How would they see themselves in their Hmong, Karen, Oromo, Eritrean neighbors? How would they recognize the values that are important to them? At various times in American history, we've had crisis moments like the one we're living in now, where people were ostracized, where laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1881, the Johnson-Reed Act of 1923-24, organizations like the Public Safety Commission created here in Minnesota that made every immigrant who had not become a citizen sit down and swear on a Bible and respond to questions about why had they not become a citizen yet. You can see those records at the Minnesota Historical Society. You can see many of them signed with an X by people who had not yet learned to read and write. That there's been that kind of attack and that kind of repression in the past. But there has also been solidarity and collaboration and joining together in organizing unions, creating a labor movement, in creating a farmer labor party in Minnesota in the 1920s and 1930s. There have been times when people have come together despite language differences, despite different religions, to recognize the humanity that they have in common, and the ability by organizing together to have an impact and make life better for all. In the year 2000, there was a strike in Minneapolis. 9 hotels, workers at 9 hotels went on strike. They came from 14 different countries and cultures. If you can imagine what it would be like to strike a downtown Minneapolis hotel, strikers had to picket 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's a big geography. They picketed with their friends who tended to speak the same language. And the labor historian has to admit that after a couple of nights, they started to get bored. And so they began singing and dancing. And then someone had the brilliant idea, which is what happens when people come together and are open with each other. Someone had the brilliant idea that the group of Hmong folks at the Hilton, or the group of Karen folks at one of the other hotels, they should move over to the next group and teach them their song and their dance. And this remarkable cultural exchange began to develop within that strike and help the workers maintain their hope and energy and solidarity, and ultimately were successful. So I want to encourage you to think about your own immigrant roots. I want you to think about the American history of otherizing, repressing immigrants, but also the American history about organizing immigrants with each other and immigrants with people who may be 2 or 3 generations away from that new experience and have found ways to come together. that's what continues to give me hope. And being up here in Wright County with you gives me hope tonight. So thank you.
So folks, remember the drill. If you have questions, please raise your hands, write them down, and we'll have them passed up here. In the meantime, I'm just going to stall while you come up with your own great ideas. And that's, as you guys were talking, these were just absolutely phenomenal. Could we give it up for them one more time? Those are just absolutely fascinating discussions. One of the tensions that I heard as both of you were talking is the tension between idealism and materialism, or between an idea of what it means to be an American versus an activity of being an American. And I love the scripture that you quoted, Angela, about community as activity. It's not a piece of paper, it's what you do. That's the foundation of your basic human dignity. It's not what document the government gives you, it's what your activities are. And I've always thought of citizen as a verb. And I think that that's what that's speaking to. And what Peter's talking about when he asks us to investigate our own immigrant roots, that means don't take them for granted. That means do the work to think about them. That means investigate their complexity. So there seems to be a tension between real life complexity and idealized images or aesthetics that are then weaponized against us. So on that idea, on that question, that sort of tension between the ideal and the actual, how does that influence your take on Christian nationalism or our history of labor? What do you think?
Yeah, Christian nationalism is based on an idealized, certainly, version of history. But behind that, and I see this in all different kinds of churches and places, some of the problems, I think, as a journalist with the reporting of Christian nationalism is it tends to be sensationalized. So you'll get, a New York Times reporter goes to Alabama and they find the wackiest preacher that they can find. And they'll say, this is Christian nationalism. And then all of everybody else in the Midwest and across the country can go, well, we don't know what that's like. That's not a problem for us. But within the denomination that I serve in, the LCA, we really had to confront our own complicity with a history of racism within white Christianity, especially after the massacre at Mother Emanuel in Charleston, South Carolina. And the shooter was an avowed white supremacist. He walked into the church, he sat there with the parishioners, went to Bible study for an hour, and killed them at the end of Bible study, and killed them because they were Black, and wrote a manifesto about his white supremacist ideas. So in the ELCA, and he was a member of an ELCA Lutheran church. So I think all of us, especially all of us who are white Christians in America, have to confront our own history and our own role in how racism has been baked into a lot of ideas that people have about who a Christian is, about what Jesus himself looks like. Look at an image of Jesus in your church, if you look Middle Eastern. So I think there is that gap between the ideal and the real, and I think a lot of it comes from this unwillingness, inability, which is in many ways understandable, to grapple with some of these harder parts of our own history as Americans. We all want to think, well, my ancestors were the good guys. My ancestors were on the right side of the Civil War, maybe up here in the North. But what we have to grapple with here in Minnesota is the treatment of Indigenous Minnesotans. And so I think that gap is a very important part of this. And certainly it comes from an unwillingness to confront the true stories. But as Peter's saying, when we do get to the true stories, that's when we can make some really positive change and move forward and work together and find a really more beautiful truth in our actual stories than this, who wants a homogenized version of white ancestor family story? I want to tell about my ancestors from Stearns County who only spoke German up until like World War II. So we all want to have our own stories.
Great, thank you. I want to share an idea with you. A friend of mine who is an African-American musician spoke at a gathering that I was at, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago. And he used a term that I, as a history teacher for more than 40 years, had never actually used. And that is, he referred to people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and a lot. He called them our confounding fathers. And I thought, that's brilliant. That's so helpful to think about the contradictions, the tensions, that, you know, history is we develop a mature taste for history, hopefully. And as a lifelong educator, I'm ashamed to say that the American educational system has done a poor job, not only teaching our history, but inculcating in young people a willingness to deal with confounding ideas. And I think we need to wrestle with that history, not just find a narrative that clicks for us, that makes us feel good.
I love that. I think that's fantastic. And it's further proof that you can't hate someone who's real, and real people are complicated.
Yeah.
That's a much quicker way to do it. Just one quick announcement. We have 150 people with us on Zoom right now. Let's say hello to Zoom, shall we? We have a couple questions that I think pivot around the role of the state and everything that we're talking about. We've talked a little bit about sort of theological visions, and we talked about sort of the practices of culture too. So the question is, what is the function of our government relative to some of the stuff that we're talking about right now? So we have a couple questions about the legal authority that ICE might have to be doing some of the stuff that they're doing. And also concerns about the way that they're doing without badges, notification, and in masks. So the question for both of you, however you want to approach it, is what is the state's role in the concerns that you've raised today in general, but more specifically with what ICE is doing with immigration right now?
Well, you know, I think that it forces us to ask, what do we mean when we say we live in a democracy? You know, does the government reflect the will of the people? We heard, you know, Angela brought up the point about this Brian Wilson, you know, and the idea that the right to vote should be taken away from women.
Douglas
Wilson,
if
excuse me.
Not from the Beach Boys.
Not from the
Yes.
Beach Boys, sorry.
Too soon.
We have heard the president say that he wants to change the way the census the information is gathered, ignoring the Constitution's use of the word persons. You know, we really have to ask, you know, how is this meant to be a democracy? How do we make it a democracy? And if in fact we're in a moment that, I don't know that either Angela or I or Aric have used the word fascism yet tonight, but let me put that word in the room, you know, where the state is organized against the people to control us, to deny us a voice, to shape what we're able to do in our daily lives. So I think, not to, you know, go philosophical on us, but I think we need to ask, what do we think a democracy is, and how is government shaped in a democratic way, and how can we protect that, implement that, make that the number one concern?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about what democracy is and who has a voice in democracy, Yeah, I'm 40 for people who are around my age. What we have known in a democracy is a democracy that's basically pay to play. And if you want to have any kind of influence or voice, you've got to have a lot of money behind it. And so I think that piece of who gets to have a voice in democracy, it's fueled a lot of Trump's success, this sense of nihilism and disenchantment. And I think that's a real thing that we have to grapple with. Just the amount of erosion in our democracy before 2016. But I also do want to say when we're talking about ICE, and I'll just say too, when we're talking about fascism, every time that I speak, I carry this book. This book is Life Together, and it's written by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So Bonhoeffer, and I'm a person of German Lutheran heritage. Bonhoeffer was the exception. Most German Lutherans signed the pledge to Nazism and to Adolf Hitler. And so there's a real sense in which we are watching things replay from history. And one of the things that we're watching replay with this militarization of ICE, which follows on the heels of the militarization of local police forces, which follows on the heels of just increasing weaponry on American streets in American schools. One of the things that we're seeing is the creation of an independent force answerable only to the highest levels of the federal government. ICE does not have any kind of local enforcement. ICE is often instead at odds with local law enforcement. And ICE is also not a part of the military hierarchy. So I think moving forward, part of addressing what's happening with the militarization of ICE and with ICE's actions on the streets is enlisting and joining forces with military hierarchy, with local police forces. You know, we'll see in Minneapolis, but I live in Minneapolis, but you know, there is a real threat to these established systems of law and order, of local and state government that ICE is attempting to get around. And that is the way that fascist authoritarian governments, like in Nazi Germany, like in communist Russia, took over by creating a militarized, weaponized force that was outside local established authority, whether it's police or whether it's military.
This is so very fascinating. My uncle taught English in Laos in 1964. His lifetime military, his whole life. And I recently found out that he's never voted in his entire life, not once. Because as a career military person, he realizes that there has to be a definite division between the military and civilian leadership. I'm not sure I agree with his particular decision, but the principle behind it is exactly what Angela's talking about. And the idea that we currently have military folks policing American citizens on American land is absolutely problematic. It's immoral, it's un-American, it's all those things. It's a real big problem. And so I'm glad that we brought up the other F word and we're starting to talk a little bit about fascism. And I think that there's a great point of connection between the two comments that you guys are making, because fascism is largely aesthetic. It's a feeling. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about that. And one of the questions that we've got, I think was directed towards Angela, but we can all talk about it. We're talking about the hypersexualized appearance of people in the current administration. So when you think of folks like Kristi Noem or Pam Bondi, or Pete Hegseth for that matter, we have people who are doing professional government jobs who were given those jobs because of how they look, which is a big part of the fascist aesthetic. So do you guys have any, that is a horrible question, but do you guys have any, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I have a lot to say about that. But one of the things that I will say too is this is also connected to wealth, because we've now tied beauty standards to ability to pay for plastic surgery in this country. And so it's, you know, if you follow fashion, if you follow pop culture, and even seeing the things that my boys are watching on YouTube, there's a real fetishization of wealth as it's connected to sexual attraction, as it's connected to beauty. And, you know, what is success for Donald Trump? that this has become the beauty standard in this country. But I think that it's also tied to, this is tied to actually in a very surprising way that maybe a lot of us, even who were very involved with evangelical Christianity decades ago, wouldn't have predicted, that this is an outgrowth of a fundamentalist Christian culture that has long been policing, especially women's appearance. We are also seeing it with men and boys with this increased need to have like six-pack abs, with needs to have very visible muscle, with more and more young boys looking for things like supplements. The newest, most popular surgery in Washington, D.C. for men, anyone know what it is? Chin implant. Chin implant for, stronger jawline. So all kinds of material on this, but it really is an outgrowth of, and again, I'm saying this word purposefully. A lot of people will want to say, well, you shouldn't talk about Christian nationalism because it really just means you don't like Republicans or you're just not conservative. This is not a conservative movement. It is rooted in fundamentalism, and there's a big difference. But one of the reasons that you can really tell that this movement is rooted in fundamentalism is that fundamentalism, whether it's Islamic fundamentalism as practiced by the Taliban, whether it's Hindu fundamentalism as practiced in India today, there's a policing of gender norms to a high degree. And so one of the precursors to what we now kind of call mega face for these these plastic surgery procedures that are so popular in Washington, one of the precursors to that is 5-10 years ago, all over Christian right internet, which a lot of you are probably less familiar with than I am, lucky for you, fixation on women's leggings as a scourge for everything wrong with the world. Leggings. And so you just go deeper and deeper into these dives and realize how much it is an aesthetic movement and how much it is tied to gender norms, policing of gender norms. And ultimately, right, this is about making money for people at the very top. And it's about keeping everybody else in line and keeping everybody else fixated on fitting into these very particular boxes that, guess what, nobody fits into perfectly. And it's a recipe for disaster for everyday, ordinary American families, and especially for kids.
That's hard to follow. Let me just say that I do think that it's then worth thinking about the insecurity that rests at the center of that. And so it may present itself publicly as powerful, but in the dark of night or in front of the mirror in the bathroom, it's insecurity that's driving it. And so somehow, and I love the idea that we're talking about the aesthetics of politics and how important that is. It isn't just about abstract ideas, but it's also, it's about people being insecure. And it's useful, I think, to go back and think about those immigrant cultures that our great-grandparents, grandparents brought to this country, or that newcomers are bringing to this country now, and their own sense of integrity, of who they are, and how, unfortunately, the ways they're going to be bombarded by the dominant culture in the United States to try to make them insecure, that they have to be something other than what they are or their families for generations have been.
So the last question was slightly skewed towards Angela. So this one's slightly skewed towards yours. As long as we're always slightly skewed, I think we're doing okay. I'll read this one directly. From your historical view, is the militarization of ICE a recognizable step towards a police state more generally, or is that linkage overblown?
I certainly don't think the linkage is overblown. I think that Angela's point earlier about the militarization of local police and which is certainly an issue that those of us here in Minnesota, have been thinking about for at least the last 5 years. How our society, the policing in our society has become increasingly militarized. I'm thinking just a quick story. In 2008, the Republican Party held its national convention in St. Paul. Some of us may remember that. And there had been an effort shortly before that to unionize Jimmy John's restaurants. The labor historian has to bring a labor story in, but and one of the activists who had led the organizing was fired. And he got the idea that during the Republican National Convention, oh no, it wasn't that he got the idea, he had won a legal suit that under the terms of the National Labor Relations Act, he had been unjustly fired for unionizing. And so Jimmy John's had been ordered to take him back. And it just so happened that this was during the Republican National Convention. And he announced that he was going back to work at the Mall of America, and that he was going to take the light rail from the Franklin station in Minneapolis out to the mall for his first shift back. And he invited everybody in the labor movement who was interested to come and have a rally at the light rail station, and then get on the train and go to the mall, and come and have something at Jimmy John's when Aric went back to work. And so there was the rally. People got on the light rail. And if you were here in 2008, you may remember that there was a lot of money given to the St. Paul Police Department. I'm not talking about Minneapolis, the St. Paul Police Department. They got all kind of new hardware and equipment. And we called them Ninja Turtles, that they were dressed up like Ninja Turtles, wearing masks. And there were a bunch of them, and they got on the light rail. And when people tried to get off at the mall, the cops blocked the doors on the light rail trains and said, no, nobody can get off. And it was wonderful. There were people on the train who demanded their right to shop. We're going to the mall. They didn't know anything about the labor conflict. They were just, but there was a militarization, masks, new hardware, denying people their rights to get on and off a light rail. I hadn't thought of that until just now, that's a precursor for the kind of militarization that we're seeing and talking about. And of course, like many of these kinds of things, that you sort of accept it by degree. And by the time you're ready to use the F word and call it fascism, now they're so deeply in place that it's a hell of a lot harder to do anything about it. We get used to it. We've been being primed for this for quite some time, even in the great blue state of Minnesota. More questions?
I just want to ask this one because it's going to be fun, but I'm going to talk for a little bit first to make it look like that's not what I'm doing. And I think there's some questions about contradiction in perspectives, and contradictions inherent in ideology is the larger sense of the question. But it really comes down to, is Jesus Christ woke?
We should have that at church conferences. I think that we have a lot of words right now that have become so overused that they've become meaningless. So I think Christians become one of those words. It means something very different than it originally meant. I think Democrats become one of those words. Republican, conservative, liberal. So I think most of these words, and this is really an example of white culture co-opting something that came out of Black culture and turning it upside down to mean something different than it ever meant. I can't believe, I want to tell us a quick story. After the murder of George Floyd, my kids were pretty little at the time, but there was like a little protest in our neighborhood, and so I was doing something for church that day related, and my husband took our two boys out to this protest, and they were holding signs, and my brother is 5 years younger than me, and my brother is married to a Black woman. He has biracial kids, and my brother's always been like much more up on Black culture than I am. And so at this time, right, woke had not yet been taken over by the right-wing politics. And so I remember my brother saw these pictures of my kids at a protest, and my brother said about my oldest son, he was like, "Oh, he's so woke." And I was like, "Oh, thanks, Kevin." Like, I felt so like maybe I'm doing something right as a parent, because it's very hard to feel like you're always doing anything right as a parent, especially as a mom in 2025 in America. It felt like it was such a compliment, and to see that word be turned upside down to mean something totally different, and to refer to basically just anything that maybe makes people feel uncomfortable or people don't like. I mean, I just think so much of it is throwaway. So I don't know, is Jesus Christ, what was the question? Is Jesus woke? Sure. I mean, I think we all need to be awake. Jesus is much more awake than any of us. And hey, I do believe he rose again. So he's woke, he's here. But is it helpful to say he's woke when, probably not. I don't really care. I don't want to use these words that I think have become meaningless. So
Got anything on that one?
No, I'm going to pass on that.
So folks, we are actually sort of slowly running out of time, but we have space for two different sort of themes of questions. A number of questions, some from online, some from many of you in the room, deal with two final central concerns. And the first one was asked a number of different ways, and that's, in essence, how do we treat people we disagree with? Whether that's an ICE agent actively involved in doing something that we find reprehensible, or whether that's your neighbor. How should we treat people with whom we have deep core disagreements?
I just talked, so go ahead.
Oh, well, I mean, frankly, I'm more interested in how do we work with the people that we do agree with in order to build more connection and solidarity and hopefully power. Yeah, I mean, and I think we are seeing a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump having serious misgivings now because their farms are not doing well, or the tariffs are going to have an impact, or prices are going up at the supermarket. And, my minimal wisdom is, don't start a conversation with someone like that by saying, "I told you so." That's probably not going to get you anywhere. But again, I think that we don't figure out how to actually do things with each other that we may agree in broad terms with, and start to figure out what are the ways that we can come together, practice mutuality and cooperation, and build and really build some strength. So we're struggling on the east side of St. Paul right now that there's an iron foundry that is spewing lead and silica onto a neighborhood that's largely first-generation immigrant. And there are maybe 85 workers in the foundry, most of whom are white, most of whom don't live in the neighborhood. Life has changed in terms of where people live and where people work. And there's a group of activists who are trying first to mobilize the immigrants to consider that they have a right to have a voice. Maybe they can push the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to actually try to control pollution. And then to figure out how do we have a conversation with the workers to talk about what's happening to them. If the neighbors are being bombarded with soot and lead and their kids are getting asthma, what are the workers being exposed to and what are they bringing home on their clothing? And how can we build a movement that brings those blue collar white workers together with those first generation immigrants? And I'll be the first to say it's not easy. There's a lot of stuff in the way, but people are willing to try, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I agree that certainly needs to happen, and yes, it is hard. I do want to give a quick answer to this one because this question about how do you talk to people that you disagree with, that how do you have conversations, build bridges, this is probably the most common question that I get asked in my work. And really when I wrote Red State Christians, I was very hopeful of the potential for conversation. I'm also somebody who comes from a very mixed political family. I have very close family members who've long been frequent attendees of Trump rallies. I'm sure many of you might be in that same place as well. I, have, prior to the congregation that I serve now, I served a congregation in McLeod County, where most of my congregation voted for Trump. Prior to that, I was in another large suburban congregation that was much more conservative. Prior to that, I was in the hometown of Richard Nixon. And I actually interned for a Republican congressman years ago, back in 2006, for Jim Ramstad, who don't make many Republicans like that anymore. But all that to say, this has been the basis of much of the work I've done, and it's gotten harder and harder to do. I think there's a couple important steps to approaching it. The first one is we have to see one another as human beings first. And that's gotten really, really difficult because we look at each other and immediately go through a checklist in our minds of what somebody's wearing, what somebody's saying, where somebody's from. And we do make political assumptions about each other. And some of it is a safety concern. And so that's the first thing, is just as much as we can treat one another as human beings first. But the second piece is a churchy word called discernment. And you have to use discernment when spending your emotional capacity to have these conversations. So discerning, I think what Peter's getting at, who wants to have these conversations. I was involved with a group mostly of evangelicals back in 2022, many of whom did not believe Christian nationalism existed. And we did a bunch of polling of Americans about Christian nationalism. But one of the most important data points to come out of that study and further research on Christian nationalism is that the largest group of folks are not diehard Christian nationalists, but people who have some, we call them sympathizers. So I think you have to discern sort of where you spend your energy, where you spend your time, know when to shake the dust off your feet and to walk away, not to break the relationship necessarily, but to break the conversation. And I will also say though too, that some of this incremental change does happen in conversations in your families, in your communities. It's not going to happen from a top-down Democratic consultant making a plan. It's going to happen from our families and our communities. And I have had people who were diehard Trump voters in both elections who have come to me since and said, all right, I've seen the light. So it does happen. And, I think that it does happen through relationships and through trust, and just got to spend that discernment wisely.
So we are kind of out of time, But the most frequently asked question that came from all of you here and all of you online was, what do I do? Like, what's next? And so we can ask our friends up here that question, but I'm just as interested in hearing from you all. If you have ideas, I'm going to ask Angela and Peter, but if you got an idea, raise your hand and share with the rest of it, if you would, please. What do you guys think? What's next? What do we do?
Have conversations with your local law enforcement, sheriffs, police chiefs about their relationship with ICE and create some kind of agreement about how they protect immigrant people.
Volunteer for the school board election.
Nice.
You might want to repeat those.
Thank you. All right. So can we go just be remedial real quick? Let's go back so we can tell our friends. The first one was, oh, so talk to people. Mhm.
How they work with ICE, how they protect immigrant people from their community.
So our first suggestion is to get a little bit more involved. Maybe have a meeting with your sheriff or your local police chief. First, maybe ask them questions about their implication in ICE's activities. Many of you may or may not know that we had a state law about 2 years ago that we were considering that would prohibit coordination between ICE and local law enforcement. But one of the challenges in moving that bill was the amount of misinformation and disinformation that was all around it. And so we talked about that a lot, knowing we didn't have the votes, and said what we need is for people to have more conversations with law enforcement and with their neighbors so that we get past this boogeyman of a sanctuary city, which is not a legal term and has no actual meaning. So to follow up on that, yeah, having conversations with people so that they understand that it's actually good for local law enforcement not to have to police immigration, because then they can take care of other sort of more crimes in our communities. And next offer was run for school board. There's other stuff you can run for too. Just please don't run for Senate in St. Cloud. Appreciate if you don't do that. That would be nice. That's more work for me. I'd rather you not. And then come to the training that we talked about before on the 16th, correct? It's a rapid response training. And I'll talk about it one more. September 16th from 6:30 to 8, the South Bridge Room at the Monticello Community Center. It's an interactive learning session on what it means to be a constitutional observer. My understanding is that that means that you're going and you're watching to see what's going on and providing some testimony and witness to what happens. So thank you for that. Other suggestions from you all to you all for things that you can do next.
Actually, some people here are involved in this book, and they get posters that they can put up in businesses that say no ICE. And also you can inform them that they can set aside a space that's just for employees. They're on public property, private property, and without a warrant, ICE really is not supposed to go.
Okay, so the next suggestion was to talk to local businesses, maybe local community leaders, see if they'd be willing to publicly proclaim that they're not interested in cooperating with ICE, or that they have an aversion to it just in general. Great. Yeah, great. And to the front, there was another question that I didn't address earlier, but since you're bringing it up, we might as well. And the question was whether or not some of our organizations could potentially be infiltrated, or if people are going to get into some of our other organizations. Being in politics, I think it's generally a pretty good idea to just automatically assume that someone's recording something every time you're talking. Someone could be watching at any point. I'm not saying that to be paranoid, but just to say that it's not a bad idea to always be sensitive and thoughtful about what your audience is and where your message is going. I think that's a really important part of politics that most people involved in traditional politics actually don't understand, is know the room you're in. and know the folks you're talking to. Again, not in any sense do I think ICE is infiltrating Indivisible. But I will say that just in general, sometimes, it's good to be aware of the complexity of the room you're in. Great. So donate to the immigrant law. I'm sorry, the full title. Minnesota Immigrant Law Association, also Legal Aid. There are other organizations that are doing a lot of this work to help people for free when they can. Right. Other, no. Is there? I'm just kidding. I'm just like, I actually, yeah, is it mine? No, and it is very important, I think, as Peter was mentioning earlier, to think of power. And in the world we're in right now, power is often exercised by elected officials. You have two choices. You can be one or you can annoy them. Those are your two choices. There's not really a third one. If you want the world to look like the world you want to live in, those decisions get made by people who got votes. So politics and citizenship is not just about elections. It's not just about November 5th, 6th, or whatever. It's about every single day that you live in community is an opportunity to make your community stronger. Don't wait for October or November to go knock a door or talk to your neighbor about how they feel about issues you care about. That's your job every day when you wake up as an American. And this is a theme that I think came up here before earlier. You cannot be a nationalist and a patriot in a democracy. Those words don't work together. Nationalism is about the elimination of difference, and democracy is about the management of difference, not its eradication. Democracy is a technology for managing and encouraging tensions between people, but letting them get along at the same time. It's not about everyone agreeing with you or everyone being the same as you, which is exactly what nationalism does. So you here today are the actual real patriots. So with that, we're out of time.
Too good.
But quickly, if I may, Angela's books. Red State Christians, Disciples of White Jesus. Angela Denker. Everybody, Angela. And I wish we could all take a chance with Peter. Take a class, excuse me, not chance, that was rude. I wish we could all take a class with Peter. But since we can't, let's just applaud him. Peter Rachleff, please. Thanks for being here, everybody. See you around next time.